In the sprawling cityscape of Los Angeles, where palm trees sway against blue skies and Hollywood lights dazzle millions, a sinister shadow stalked the streets unnoticed for decades. His victims were women, mostly black, mostly poor, many struggling with addiction or survival sex work. They vanished or were found discarded in alleys, wrapped in filthy blankets, or left in dumpsters like trash. For more than 2 decades, someone was murdering women in South Los Angeles. Yet for years, no one paid attention. And when they finally did, they discovered something chilling. The killer had taken a 14-year break and then started up again. That's how he earned the nickname the world would never forget, the Grim Sleeper. His real name was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., and by the time police caught up with him, he had terrorized a community, evaded capture, and exposed the deep cracks in how society treats its most vulnerable. This is not just the story of a serial killer, it's a story of silence, neglect, and the cost of being invisible. Lonnie Franklin was born on August 30th, 1952, in Los Angeles, California. Not much is known about his early childhood, but he eventually joined the U.S. Army and served as a mechanic. In July 1975, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was dishonorably discharged from the United States Army following his release from prison for a violent sexual assault. The incident occurred in April 1974 while Franklin was stationed in Stuttgart, West Germany. He and 2 other servicemen approached a girl under the guise of asking for directions and offered her a ride home. Once she accepted, they held a knife to her throat, drove her to a remote field, and took turns raping her. Despite the traumatic experience, the victim managed to remain composed. She pretended to show interest in Franklin and asked for his phone number, which she later gave to the police, an act that ultimately led to his identification and arrest. During the assault, the men took photographs of the victim, a disturbing detail that would later mirror Franklin's pattern of photographing the women he raped and murdered in Los Angeles. After he was released, he returned to the U.S. and settled into a quiet life in South L.A. Franklin blended in well. He married, had children, worked as a sanitation worker and part-time garage mechanic. He was known in the neighborhood for being helpful, sometimes fixing cars for neighbors or offering odd jobs. But beneath this seemingly mundane exterior was a cold-blooded predator who stalked women under the cover of night. His hunting grounds were the streets of South Los Angeles, an area historically plagued by poverty, police distrust, and systemic neglect. And that neglect would play right into his hands. The first confirmed victim was Deborah Jackson, whose body was found on August 10, 1985. She had been shot 3 times in the chest and dumped in an alley. Over the next 3 years, a disturbing pattern emerged. Women began turning up dead, shot, strangled, sometimes both. The victims all shared similar profiles. They were black, often involved in sex work or battling addiction, and most had last been seen in the South LA area. Despite these obvious similarities, the cases were largely ignored. Police didn't sound the alarm. Media coverage was minimal. The victims' families were left to grieve alone. Between 1985 and 1988, the killer claimed at least 7 more women. Then, suddenly, the murders stopped, or so it seemed. For 14 years, there were no new bodies linked to the killer. It was as if he had disappeared. This gap in activity is what led the LAPD and later the media to label him the Grim Sleeper. But that nickname, while chilling, was based on an assumption that the killer had truly gone dormant. The truth may be more complicated. Many experts now believe Franklin may have continued to kill during those years, but his victims, like before, simply weren't discovered or weren't connected due to poor record-keeping and lack of investigation. Then, in 2002, the nightmare resumed. Victims began turning up again with the same brutal injuries, gunshots, signs of strangulation, and evidence of sexual assault. One victim, Princess Berthomew, was just 15 years old. Another, Janicia Peters, was found in a garbage bag, dumped in a dumpster near Western Avenue in 2007. By then, investigators realized that these weren't isolated cases. A serial killer had returned, or never left at all. But even with mounting evidence, police struggled to make a breakthrough. The investigation was hampered by a lack of DNA matches and a general apathy from the public and press. It wasn't until 2010, 25 years after the first known killing, that they got their break. And it came from an unexpected source: familial DNA. Franklin's son Christopher had been arrested and had his DNA entered into the system. When investigators compared his profile to DNA recovered from crime scenes, they noticed something unusual. The samples weren't an exact match, but close enough to be a relative. That meant the killer was likely someone related to Christopher. Investigators soon zeroed in on Lonnie Franklin Jr. Police began surveilling Franklin quietly, watching his movements, collecting discarded items, napkins, utensils, pizza crusts, anything that might carry DNA. Eventually, they gathered enough to confirm a match. On July 7, 2010, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested outside his home on 81st Street in South LA. Neighbors were stunned. Some refused to believe it. Others admitted they'd long found him odd, but never suspected he was capable of murder. When investigators searched Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s home, just a short distance from the South LA corridor where many of the victims had been discovered, they uncovered a scene more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Inside his garage and bedroom, they found hundreds of photographs, most depicting women in unsettling conditions. Some appeared unconscious, others looked lifeless. Many were clearly in vulnerable states, their expressions vacant or fearful. Among the evidence were dozens of videotapes and chilling trophies, personal items taken from his victims. The most damning find was a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun, later confirmed to be the murder weapon. As investigators pored over the photographs, some of the women were eventually identified as known victims, but many remain nameless, their stories lost, their identities still a mystery. In total, Franklin was charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. For Anitra Washington, the only known survivor, Washington's testimony would become a critical piece of the case. She described how in 1988, Franklin had offered her a ride, then shot her in the chest, sexually assaulted her, and dumped her out of his car. Miraculously, she survived and remembered his face. Her story aligned perfectly with evidence found in Franklin's home, including photographs of her taken shortly after the attack. She was the living proof that the grim sleeper had never really slept. The trial finally began in February 2016, following years of delays and countless pre-trial motions. When the prosecution laid out its case, the evidence was overwhelming. DNA matched. Ballistics confirmed the same gun had been used in multiple murders. 2 criminalists testified that it was the exact weapon that killed one of the victims. A survivor bravely took the stand to recount her harrowing encounter. Then came the most chilling revelation: a trove of photographs and trophies Franklin had kept, haunting reminders of his victims. Through it all, Lonnie Franklin Jr. sat in the courtroom, emotionless and unmoved. He never flinched, never spoke, never showed a flicker of remorse. It was as if humanity had long since abandoned him. The trial revealed the gruesome patterns of Franklin's crimes. His victims were often lured into his vehicle, sometimes under the pretense of buying drugs or offering a ride. Once inside, he would shoot, strangle, or assault them, sometimes all 3. He kept photographs as trophies, documenting their final moments. He disposed of them in alleyways, dumpsters, or behind buildings. The city's most marginalized women had become prey to a killer who knew no one would come looking. On May 5, 2016, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found guilty on all counts. His victims in order of death were Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Lacrica Jefferson, Alicia Alexander, Princess Bartholomew, Valerie McCorvey, and Janicia Peters. 2 months later, he was sentenced to death. But even that couldn't undo the damage. The trial had exposed not just a killer, but a decades-long failure of the justice system. Families had pleaded for help and been ignored. Mothers had reported daughters missing, only to be told they were probably just on drugs or ran off. It wasn't until the body count grew too high to ignore that anyone truly listened. Even in death, Franklin left unanswered questions. Authorities believe he may have killed many more than the 10 victims he was convicted for. More than 1,000 photographs were found in his home. Some were released to the public to help identify the women. 35 women remain unidentified and may never be identified. In the end, the true extent of his crimes may be buried in forgotten case files, untested rape kits, and the memories of a community that was failed for far too long. On March 28, 2020, Lonnie Franklin Jr. died in prison of natural causes while awaiting execution. There was no final confession, no closure, just the quiet end of a man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight. The grim sleeper may be gone, but the pain he left behind continues to ripple through time. His victims were daughters, sisters, mothers, real people whose lives were cut short and whose stories were nearly erased. Their silence was not their choice. It was imposed by indifference, by broken systems, and by a world that too often looks away. For many, the pain goes beyond the loss itself. Family members and advocates believe the case was not pursued with the urgency it deserved. Because the victims were young African American women, they argue that had the victims looked different or come from more affluent neighborhoods, the response would have been swifter. Authorities, however, maintain they never gave up on the case. But for those left behind, the long silence speaks louder than any official statement. If you found this story important, unsettling, or eye-opening, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more deep dives into the dark corners of true crime. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that those who were silenced are never forgotten. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe.